Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. It's great to have you here for this show. And we have a fun topic to dive into today. But before we do that, we're going to introduce ourselves like we do every time we're with you, because we just don't assume that you listened to us before and you know who we are. So I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor in the Pacific Northwest, but I'm at my Connecticut house today. And but I live in Battleground, Washington, and we got a place out there. And I serve a church in that area, the Westminster Presbyterian Church. And I've written a number of things, some books, and I've been a professor of philosophy and a real estate investor, and yada yada yada. That's about me. Why don't we send it over to you, Glenn?
I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor specializing in the Reformation. I am a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview and the Ministry Associate at Refreshments Ministries.
Okay, Tom, go ahead and introduce both yourself and the topic for the day.
All right, I'm Tom Price. I teach systematic theology, philosophy, Christian ethics, apologetics, a few other things, and I teach at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, among other places. The topic, going woo.
Yeah, you're going to have to fill us in on woo. That's obviously a term that young folks use for something that guys like Glenn and I don't have any. Well, maybe I'm speaking for Glenn. Maybe Glenn has heard of woo, but I certainly don't. Okay. So yeah. I'm the ignoramus, but maybe that's not new. Maybe I just always have been the.
I've been trying to find out what it means. I'll tell you what I think it means, and then Glenn can kind of correct me if I don't get it right. But at least it's not called going woke. So, and hopefully, even though it isn't all good necessarily, it is not that bad comparatively.
Yeah, I would much rather be woo than woke, based on what I read here in the article we're discussing today.
So going woo, the title, I guess, of the topic would be Transcendent Longings from a once reason-obsessed Silicon Valley. But the article I'm picking off of is published recently in the New Atlantic by a Tara Burton, who...
Yeah, actually, Tom, it's the New Atlantis, not the New Atlantic.
Oh, sorry, New Atlantis. Yeah, I had some notes here, so that was my typo. Tara Isabella Burton is the writer. I don't know much about her. I just kind of read the follow up at the end, and it said author of Strange Rites: New Religions for a Godless World, published in 2022. The World Cannot Give, a novel, published in 2022, and then something coming soon called Self-Made: Creating Our Identities from Da Vinci to the Kardashians. So,
right.
So someone who definitely has their antenna on the fact that religion and identity formation have really become melded together. But the title of this piece is Rational Magic: Why a Silicon Valley Culture That Was Once Obsessed with Reason is quote unquote going woo. So, I guess a good place to begin is going woo. My take is that it's talking about something of a romantic turn in the Silicon world. So Glenn, maybe you can kind of shift it. But from what I gather from the article, it's that the rational world and community that they have a part of was too reductionistic to the point of existential crisis, which opened them to have an antenna for things that formerly were considered irrational.
Nothing new under the sun. Where in the world have we heard this before? Again and again and again. Go for it, Glenn.
Yeah, the idea of woo, it's, we if you think back, there was a time when people would talk about the supernatural as sort of woo-woo stuff. Well, this is an abbreviation of that. Woo is where you're looking at, new spirituality type things, which used to be called New Agey stuff. It's where you're looking at, a sense of the supernatural in sort of the popular meaning of the word. and looking to get some kind of connection or believing you've got some kind of connection with that world, as opposed to just the mundane world that we all live in our daily lives. So,
yeah, I guess the thing that, this reminds me of is in the Enlightenment followed by Romanticism.
Yeah.
And now I think the difference between, say, the Enlightenment and what we saw in Silicon Valley with this sort of super rationality is more the utilitarian character of the contemporary sort of thing, whereas the Enlightenment people, the rationalists, they just kind of delved into almost something closer to maybe what Christianity had to say about rationality. Although obviously the Enlightenment kind of worked really hard to take any of the theological, influences out of it. But it was more. I think that the Enlightenment was different than what we see in Silicon Valley, and insofar as rationalism in Silicon Valley had, as I noted, this kind of utilitarian character. It was all about kind of instrumentality, or using reason to get things that you want. Whereas I think that, you just take a look at the French Revolution. What did they do? They made a god of reason.
I think the better analogy is the rise or the flourishing of Spiritism after World War I.
That's interesting.
Because what you see in World War I, all of the ideas of progress, that technology and science were going to lead us into a better age. What we find is all of the technology and science led us into more efficient ways of killing people.
Right.
And so on a philosophical level, you have a reaction against rationalism and the Enlightenment occurring there. Some of the earliest movements toward post-modernity show up during that period. But on a popular level, what you see is with the Lost Generation, you see people conducting seances to get in touch with their dead relatives, their husbands or their sons, their fiancés, whatever. That moved towards, now Spiritism wasn't something new that had been around for a while. It actually flourished in America in the late 19th century, along with New Thought, which is sort of proto-New Agey stuff. I mean, so these things had been around, but they become much bigger in the wake of the dissatisfaction or despair with where modernity brought them with the war. And so what we see here in Silicon Valley is not, it's the same, it's sort of the same kind of despair, but it's more on an existential level. It's more, looking at it and saying, I've got all this stuff, I've had all this success, all of these kinds of things, and I'm still feeling empty. What's missing?
Yeah, that's a great contrast, Glenn. So in the first case, when we're talking about post World War I no longer have legs. I thought I was supposed to have a flying car by now. Whereas with Silicon Valley, I have my technological, sort of gizmo, but I'm not any happier.
It's interesting with this, and I'm going to come back to it because I'm going to snail this a little bit, and walk into this where we are in this conversation already. But one of the things I want to remind myself of is why in the world does Silicon Valley take so long to get to what theologians and everything else were dealing with back after the Second World War. But before I do it, let me kind of introduce the way she introduces this whole topic. And she brings it in with a character that she interviews, and she's going to use the name Vogel, which is, if memory serves, that's a German word for bird. And she kind of plays off with the bird of Minerva and some things like that. So who is Vogel in this? So it's a young man that the author interviews who's basically disenchanted with the Silicon Valley technocratic rationalism that you guys were just talking about, something to which he at one time was wholly committed to. And so, to quote, once he ran up against its limit existentially, as Glenn was just mentioning, He said, basically, I was very, very depressed at the time. Beauty in the world, notice the aesthetic breaking through. Beauty in the world had become hauntingly distant. So there's this kind of hunger and longing going on in this person that, that kind of rationalism, reductivism doesn't attend to. It existed over a horizon beyond some mountain, but I didn't have access to it. And so where did this kind of lead Vogel? Well, I don't want to get there yet. I mean, it's going to be something she calls post-rationalism, but let's kind of back up. Where does Vogel begin? And this is very interesting for, I think,
for some of our audience,
for our audience. First of all, I think we've all been slamming this theme for a long time. One, raised a pastor's son and educated in evangelical Christian circles and
homeschool circles, not just Christian circles. Homeschool circles.
And I hear this and I see this very, very often. Then there's this teen crisis of faith, which he will end up calling a deconversion. Now, the interesting thing here, and I want people in our audience to pay close attention to the language because she uses it and the Vogel uses it. They call evangelical Christianity of this sort, quote unquote, traditional Christianity.
Right. Yeah, that is a fundamental error. That evangelical Christianity is a modern form of Christianity.
Absolutely. Which my hunch is has all of the emptiness of secularism. And this is kind of what my whole point of doing my end of the show has always been, is that kind of modern Christian evangelical vision, whatever riches it still contains, have been so defanged from their richness because of the wider riches they're embedded in, classically, that when they're embedded in the modern secularist kind of vision, they lose even the ones they're supposed to keep.
Yeah, let's stop there a second, if you don't mind, Tom.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something for evangelicalism, even while we're critiquing it.
Yeah.
If you think about the fundamentals, what people refer to as fundamentalism is based on an attempt to preserve the supernatural character of Christianity. Supernatural understood in the best sense of the term. And it became more or less associated with a kind of dogmatic, pig-headed legalism in the minds of many people, and even in practice. Saying, we all know people who have just done a real disservice to the Christian faith by the way they've tried to be faithful to the Christian faith.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that was the agenda. Nevertheless, evangelicalism, particularly in its post-World War II sort of expression, really made peace with the market, made peace with kind of the corporate world, and privatized the faith to such a degree that you could be a Christian. And again, I don't want to be unfair. I think that people who were advocates of this were thinking about people like Daniel or Joseph, who found themselves in hostile environments and were trying to be faithful. So I'm not saying this was something that was malicious in character, but there were a series of deals that I think were made.
Yeah.
And the objective was to preserve the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now, just to point out where this ends up leading, when the idea that this privatized faith and making your peace with corporate America and all of that, where this ends up going are people who are on what's it called, just fans, who do what amount to being pornography as evangelical Christians and saying that this is honoring to God. That's the extreme where this
Right.
can lead. I just read an interview with somebody who fell into that category.
Well, that I knew there had to be something you.
Yeah, because I thought of that analogy myself. But good, it's a good one.
But yeah, we ought to talk about that in another show, because if it reminds me of when Billy Graham had a conversation with a guy that was in the mob, and he said he wanted to be a mobster for Christ, and Billy Graham had to kind of just sort of talk him out of the idea.
Yeah. And I think again, I think it's fair not to be too harsh, in the sense that I don't know that. What happens is you start working with a momentum. A long time ago, Christianity started to leave a lot of its riches. And after its infighting and everything else, as it tried to calm it down through the Enlightenment, to kind of stop fighting each other, if you will. That's not the only reason for that, but that kind of part plays a part. Controlling those kind of passions and keeping them out of the public, so that civic, life can go on. Christianity trying to find its place in all of that. The understanding of creation and nature was slowly shifting, and it shifted philosophically and theologically years ago, but it's really not making its impact until now. And I think that's so to sit here and beat, kind of a generation ago evangelicals over the head for being caught in that shift without knowing it. I don't, maybe that's too harsh. I think what I'm saying is that, let's look at where we've ended up and realize we have richer things to draw upon to get, to reorient our riches back into the thicker, frame that we've been given in Christ.
Yeah, and we see it all over the place. We see young people who are raised by very engaged and loving evangelical parents who were, for the most part, theologically sound. And then those kids are looking for more. They're looking for, they love their parents, they respect them, but they're like, something's missing. And they're the ones that are going to Orthodoxy. They're the ones that are going back to sort of to Catholicism, crossing the Tiber. And I think that one of the things that we need to do as Protestants is say to those kids, the early Protestants were trying to preserve the best of the tradition, while correcting some of the errors that they wanted to correct. They weren't jettisoning the whole Christian history, all Christian history or Christendom. That wasn't their idea.
No, that's right. And there's a younger, kind of certain sword wielding, Calvinist out there who loves to chop off the head of those of us who want to retrieve certain aspects of the riches of Christian faith as sort of a postmodern, embrace. It has nothing to do with that. It has something to do with actually seeing through the way in which the Christian faith became distorted in many ways through the impact of Enlightenment and its impact even on churches. And so rather than running the direction of postmodernity and the like, we're running to actually the wisdom traditions that have shaped and gave rise to, that Scripture gave rise to, and is a kind of back and forth between Scripture and the church's reflection on it. And so what we have going on here is, you said exactly right. The early reformers could take this for granted, and they didn't need to spell it out because it was already spelled out. But as Christendom kind of breaks down, if you will, it starts to kind of divide. And then you start to have something general fill the void, whether it's natural religion, natural philosophy, there's a kind of Enlightenment interpretation of those things. You are increasingly see the riches of classic Christian views of creation and redemption get thinned out, if not, weakened. And I think that's, to the point where in an evangelical church, you can't even have someone mark the difference between being male and female as a God-given distinction in the created order as the image of God. That's when something has fundamentally gotten off track. This isn't progress towards a deeper Christian understanding of reality. This is a deep move away from it.
Yeah, and it's happening throughout sort of the popular megachurch sort of subculture. I just came across some stuff here recently. it appalled me, but it was also something that you could just kind of see coming a mile away. And it deals with some of this stuff. When you have a person like, say, Tom Ward, who is an open theist, writing books about how we should fully embrace LGBTQ, whatever alphabet soup, thing of the day, you say to yourself, well, at least I do. We could see that coming about, a decade or two back, Tom. You're not that. You're not really as sharp as you think you are, and you made some compromise. You have zero regard for the wisdom of the past. You think that you just can kind of reinvent Christianity on the spur of the moment in the sort of the cultural milieu that we find ourselves in, and anyway.
Well, and that's where you end up with, I think with the kind of what they're saying in this article is traditional Christianity isn't. It is a weakened form and a deformation of Christianity, if you will, at best. Yeah. I know John Risk calls it deformed Augustinianism, and I think that probably does characterize both modernity and modern forms of Christianity of that stripe.
Yeah, the idea of it being a weakened form of Christianity, I think, is interesting because, well, before they came out with mRNA, so-called vaccines, the way one would vaccinate someone is you would give them a weakened form of the pathogen that causes the disease. So you give them a weakened form of the disease and they develop immunity to it. Yeah. What happens when you give people a weakened form of Christianity?
Yes.
Yeah, that's exactly right. They develop an immunity to it, right?
And then there grows this kind of almost protective antagonism against it. I see it as I try to bring things that were taken for granted by the reformers into evangelical and reform circles. There is this often this you're trying to basically bring Catholicism into the context, or you're trying to bring something because it's strange, and it is strange, and yet it should be most familiar in many ways, and they don't realize that when you really read the way the church has read the scriptures, and you understand faithfully that the Spirit is going to guide the church into all things. Doesn't make the church's reading infallible, but it does mean that the wisdom is not just arbitrary, right? It's like a parent, it's like a father. He's not infallible, but you know what? There's a lot of wisdom there through their negotiating with reality in life, that when they tell their child, you know what, don't stick your finger in the light socket, it's probably wise to take a pause and say, okay, maybe there's a good reason he told me that, whether or not I can prove that scientifically or not at the moment.
Yeah, returning to the article, which is a really, I think, eye-opener for me anyway.
Yeah.
Even though it's predictable in a sense, nevertheless, the confidence, the hubris of Silicon Valley and its kind of naive confidence in human instrumental reason, to create a better world, even a perfect world. It's all falling apart. And we've got young people like this guy that we were just talking about, who left the sort of homeschool evangelical world that he knew and dove into that super optimistic utilitarian rationality, and now finds himself disillusioned once again.
But, Chris, he does come via your mission field. He comes through Seattle, Washington.
That's right. Yeah. Well, the left coast collects all of the loose, sort of particles that have gotten to float around in our country. It is all. It's like somebody takes all, like some kind of bag and just shakes it, and all of the loose stuff goes to the bottom.
Well, and it's interesting that, as she kind of talks about the Vogel's move into what you were just talking about, this kind of Silicon Valley rationalism, it's strange because this stuff was apparently going. I was in Oxford at the time as a doctoral student, and this stuff is going on right there. I had no clue it was going on. And it says the rationality community, which is what this guy moves into, It started out with some few blogs in the early 2000s. I didn't even know blogs were around in the early 2000s. I was looking up, I was just immersed in academic work. But then, the first was, quote unquote, I love the language, overcoming bias, right? It sounds very woke. Founded in 2006 and affiliated with Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute. There's kind of an economics professor, but yeah, you're exactly right. The whole notion is that through this kind of reductive rationalism, you could call it scientism, I think is another way of putting it, that through technological development and just kind of rigorous application of a reductive reason, you could basically eradicate all untruth. And you could also fix all world's problems. But they were worried about some things, is that our reason could develop something beyond our capacity to control. This is kind of your Elon Musk is tied to this kind of community. And this was kind of eye-opening in that sense, because it made sense of Musk's recent kind of existential limit placed on AI tech, because I think he's someone of this community and sees its advantages, has been part of it, but is starting to see where we can end up. And he's starting to take up that group and community's ethical concern that AI could actually become a very harmful thing, even if it could also be a savior.
Yeah, I also hear kind of echoes of Ayn Rand in all of this.
Yeah.
With this sort of rationalist sort of this ideology of rationalism. Strikes me as Randian, but also reminds me of some people. Well, objectivism and all that kind of stuff. So basically, there's a longing for reality. There's a longing for truth. There's longing for the thing that we find ourselves in, and kind of in a sense that it's marvelous. It's worth understanding. It's worth kind of clearing our minds to know it. I think all that's great, but then there's also a hostility to mystery. There's a hostility to anything that can't be reduced.
Yeah, there is this relation to reality that is very truncated and limiting, and I think I think it exhibits our fallenness, because anything that kind of doesn't become something manageable and controllable becomes something threatening and fear. This is why our own developments, our own capacity through our reason to develop a technology that could actually undo us is a testament. And this is why they're threatened by it, to our own being made in the image of God. And I think for them that they're more afraid of us being made in the image of God than the AI tech that they're afraid we create. That's just my hunch. But you see, they do. You hit it right on the nose. There was a kind of what attracts Vogel to this, because this kind of stuff would have been boring to me, even as someone when I was not a believer. I found the romantics much more attractive than this stuff. But one of the stuff that it does give them a kind of a pseudo meaning and purpose. They become almost gods in their own way, because through technology they're going to self-direct. But also there is a little telos in a purposeless world, and that is to save humanity and fight for our survival. So these things were ingredient, and they were willing to sacrifice themselves, their own well-being and flourishing, and they would make a lot of money, but they would basically contribute to global health initiatives. Your Bill Gates of the world.
Yeah, I can't think of anybody more, I guess, kind of appalling or even alarming than Bill Gates. I don't follow him very closely, but his lack of self-awareness is just stunning. I don't think that he really has a sense of how he comes across, or even, I don't know if he even understands himself. I just think he's completely taken up in this quest to manage reality.
Yeah, I still remember back in the 90s, early 90s, I believe it was, when there were a lot of people who were talking about Bill Gates as the Antichrist. At this point, I'm beginning to think they may be onto something, but that's another matter.
He's definitely a creep incarnate.
Yeah, and we were getting a little clue or a little hint every once in a while, a little glimpse at even something, I don't know, gross and sexually perverse about the guy.
Yeah, we're starting to see that stuff come out. And, even, when you start getting into stuff where you're buying up all the food, farming properties and creating fake meat, I mean, you're really talking about a dark, sinister psychology. But you're looking at the dark places. I think this kind of instrumental reason takes you when ungoverned by a proper transcendent center. I mean, and this is what's interesting about Vogel is that it became disillusioned with the utilitarian. He started to see this kind of quantifiable markers of success are disturbing. They're soulless is the language used, and then also this kind of effective altruism. What he called, kind of depowered a lot of people. It made them less interesting and vibrant as people, and more like trying to fit into a slightly soulless bureaucracy of good doing. And so this kind of woke that entered into that kind of Silicon Valley, I think backfired for figures like Vogel because it looked very superficial and it wasn't participating in the good as classic visions had, especially Christianity, so much as from the outside affirming almost we're committed to the good. It's almost like the Pharisee, right? You have your outside, thoroughly exemplifying virtue, but your inner core is rotten to the core. You're detached. You're not a participant in the good. You just kind of mimic it. You try to act like you're a part of it, but you're not. You're of your father, the devil. I mean, that's the language Christ uses. But one of the things he notes, he longed for forms of genuine friendship, based not on utilitarian goals of what he calls kind of allies, moral allies in a cause. And so this is one of the things I think the inbreaks, we are made for communion, first with God and each other. One of the things that Christian life, the first things that it does is turns us from enemies to friends of God, but then puts caritas is the language of the Latin of between human beings. So genuine friendship, not grounded in some kind of instrumental end, but grounded in reality. And so this will become something called a meta-tribe. The group tries to almost develop this community together as they break away from rationalism and open themselves up to something more, where they try to get a hold of friendship in a deeper way. So the transcendental dimensions of real friendship that are found in Christianity are longed for in our humanness, but they're not findable in the kind of empty world of rational community.
Yeah, I'd like to reflect on that a little bit more. One of the things I would say comes to mind is that, in the household, which is something I've written a lot about, the communion comes first, and then the work comes second. Now, obviously, the work is tremendously important, and it's what we do together in a household. In a pre-modern society, it would be a subsistence economy. We're all kind of at work to make a living. But what we've done in the modern world is we keep breaking things up. We keep segmenting things. We keep separating them. So what occurs is that work is transferred to the workplace, where things are much more efficient, more productive on a larger scale, and then we reduce that a household to just a place where we go at the end of the day to hang out with the people we love, but we don't do anything with them that's productive. So it seems like what I hear him describing is, okay, he doesn't have a household where he's got communion any longer. Maybe that's kind of an important thing to note here. But he's in a world where everybody is trying to make a difference, quote, and to do it effectively, quote, and efficiently, and so forth. but there's no substratum. There's no basis for it in human community. It's just been abstracted to the point where we're just talking about, okay, did we achieve our goal or not? Did we feed 5,000 people or not? You know what I'm saying?
By the time you give them bread alone, then what are they? Okay, you fed them for a day. That is good. There's nothing minimal there. But I think that kind of runs. I think that's where their disenchantment started to develop. So let's say, it's like I once asked my oldest when he was studying Martin Luther King Jr. in school. I said, "Now that you got freedom, then what?" And he kind of was like, "Why would you even say that?" And I say it because what we do and how we understand freedom is very significant. That it isn't simply about having the ability to do whatever we want, right? It is about orienting ourselves to truthfully enact ourselves with the integrity of the creatures that we are, to not let something else get in the way of it. And so, it's the same thing here. There's nothing wrong, and I fully am committed to serving in ways that we can those in need. But that isn't the end game. If there isn't a fuller vision that you bring the gospel with the giving of cold water in Jesus' name, right? It isn't simply the gospel not giving the cup of cold water or giving the cold water without the gospel. Those things are connected. Why? Because it immerses it in the whole reason for why we're here and where we're going. And so, you can have all this altruism and all this kind of patting yourself on your own back. But if you don't know why you're doing it or what the significance of it is other than just survival, and even that is becoming blurred with the whole notion of maybe it's good that we stop living here so that the environment can go on. You're starting to, in those circles with the strong environmental emphasis, see the human as the problem. And so, helping alleviate those things. So there's a lot of disenchantment, I think, that can come in that world once you realize that when they work with such a fragmented vision and such a reduced vision, it doesn't answer our fundamental human cries and hunger the way they want it to.
Yeah, we need to pause for a moment, too, and look at the entire notion of effective altruism, which terminologically, that sounds perfectly fine. Sounds like a great idea. You want your money to be spent effectively, right? But the problem is that effective altruism is completely statistical.
Yeah.
It doesn't deal with individuals. It deals with statistics. And if some individuals have to be, sacrificed for the greater good, or not helped for the greater good, so be it. As long as you're doing the most for the most you can for the most number of people, utilitarian, you're good. And it's a fundamental problem with utilitarianism in general. It ignores the individual.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there's also this kind of sense that there's something wrong with this, not just project, but people who are kind of drawn to it. Sometimes, in a joking way, people refer to techie types like Elon Musk and Bill Gates as guys who suffer from some kind of what's the word I'm looking for? It begins with an A. Autism. Right? Yeah.
Which in the article says a lot of these people attracted to that field are in that spectrum.
Yeah. Actually, there have been studies that show that people in engineering, sciences, math, those kinds of things tend toward autism, where people in the arts tend toward depression.
Well, yeah, that's an interesting thought. but getting back to the autism, what you have with autism is a kind of focus on a narrow range of things to the exclusion of the rest of reality. And that's one of the reasons why these people have a hard time, I think, socially in many cases, where they just lack the ability to read small, I guess, signs that would let them know how to get along with others better or to read the situation well. They're just blinkered most of the time. Now, on the positive side, they're very bright in a very narrow range of things.
Yeah.
You know, if you have a problem with any of those things, they're the people you want to turn to. So we tend to pathologize things that I think are gifts sometimes. You know, there are people who are wired this way by God for a purpose, and we don't need to drug them up. But we do need to help them understand they need other people to kind of fill out their understanding of the world, because they can't see it all. They just see this narrow thing.
Well, and I think that's the insight that this Vogel comes to, is that the way we've narrowed the world is dehumanizing and leading to depression and everything else. And there is something else there. And one of his lines is that where he basically says is, I felt detached from history itself and my participation in it. So what you have here, I mean, we've talked about theologically, is someone who radically sees themselves as a non-participant in the reality that they are already a participant in. And this is something we talk about, kind of the way they see themselves as this detached rationality, that they're separate and they're able to kind of piece reality within their frame of reference and govern it, give it meaning, give it everything else, determine it. They're gods. And I do think that there is, our fallen nature that rejects our called to glorification. It's the Western way of putting, our call to partaking of the divine light, as the way the early church put it. That call is deformed here. And now they see themselves as basically, thinking of themselves as gods in one sense, realizing they're not in another, and yet having this immortal longing in the end to retrieve something of that. And so when they move towards this, what they call these irrational dimensions, which allow for a religious dimension or a transcendent dimension to enter into their world, they start what she calls post-rationality. They embrace this kind of trend of post-rationality. But they're really not looking at it the way, in terms of conversion, embrace of something that uproots you. You're not being uprooted here. It's really looking at tradition and ritual and symbol and myth because of their beneficial effects, right? It's the riches that these things can provide for you to have meaning, purpose, and a fuller kind of existence, rather than an uprooting you and placing you back in the reality where that is a given along with it, like Christianity.
Yeah, this is, of course, the modern turn. I mean, it's all about kind of the reception of reality, and not and kind of a participation in reality itself. That turn, we see with Descartes or any modern, thinker, where the starting point is my perception of the world and not the world itself. And there's this conviction that the world in itself can't be known. But, where does that lead? That leads to all kinds of silly stuff, and including the kind of alienation that this guy is describing. And, transgenderism, you just name it, it's all there. And there's got to be a way back to reality. And people have tried to find a way back without falling back to, into the Christian faith, or, noting the sort of central place of faith in our epistemology. They want it faithless. They don't want any place for faith or any role left for faith in things.
Well, what you see Vogel and the other guys here doing, one of the things that I was struck by is it's a very sort of non-dogmatic approach to solving the problem of transcendence. And it's basically, you find the particular combination of things that work for you, and you can incorporate this into your rationalism and all of that as a supplement. And that is exactly the route that the New Agers, or what I prefer to call New Spirituality, did. They talked about finding one of the popular terms was psychotechnologies. Notice the language. Psychotechnologies that you could use to move you toward achieving some sort of enlightenment. Not always using that language, but that's what it came down to. So you could be involved in a Wiccan coven, go to an African drum circle, take your yoga class, and maybe do Tai Chi or something like that, and then go hang out with guys at the Renaissance Festival who were neo-pagans, and it was all good.
And then code for Google from your home office.
Right. Yeah. Now that's the one thing that's new that's added to it. But it's fundamentally, these guys are going back to what the woo-woo New Agers were doing back in the 70s and 80s, just in sort of a slightly updated version.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And one of the things she does pretty fairly in the article is she talks about the kind of widespread. I mean, you do have with this group a kind of a moving away from our old categories, left, right, center, politics. There is a willingness to kind of get away from that conversation, if you will. But they are not abandoning the kind of modern reductionism of this basically being a voluntarist view in which we are choosing and picking those things that are meaningful and provide that extra content to our life. It's what I remember Dave Bentley Hart once called it the dreamier side of the modernists' personalities. That's one way of putting it. It's they'll put the little symbol or dream catcher, right? They'll put it in their there's all these different things, or they may become more serious about a certain kind of practice or ritual. But you also have it on the right, developing, and I use that word arbitrarily. You're kind of people fascinated with the return to myth and neo-Jungian categories with Jordan Peterson, who interestingly has been a gateway often in Canada for people to at least consider these things, and they end up eventually abandoning Peterson and embracing kind of classic Christianity. I just heard from somebody this past weekend at a conference that they're getting more and more younger people coming into their churches saying, okay, well, Jordan was a step, but we now see the limits of that step and we see a fuller vision here. So interesting, you could see some of this as steps away from reductionism and a good opportunity of mission to speak into what a full vision looks like. And but you are seeing a big turn. But one of the things you see, Chris, you mentioned, well, I know we're running out of time here, but one is they are disenchanted with Descartes, finally. A quote, our Cartesian reduction of rationality to sort out computational abilities, and then the reduction of that to just communication and communicative manipulation, we have lost a lot. The notion of rationality that most of the ancient world thought they were referring to, they use words like logos and ratio. And those older notions of rationality were bound up with wisdom, were bound up with practice, and they would use the imaginal. And this is something we've talked about here, the way in which classic wisdom traditions are bound up with communities that push your identity out of yourself towards the wider web of roles and relations and hierarchies in which virtue is mandatory because you have to form into certain kind of people to be able to navigate reality and orient yourself in it right.
Yeah, this is the thing that I saw in this article as the author is describing this guy. Is it Vogel? Mm-hmm. He strikes me as a guy who spends way too much time online.
Yeah,
probably single. He's bright, but bright in a very narrow range of things. I suspect, now this is probably not fair, but I suspect that he's not actually competent in sort of the physical world, even at a social level. I suspect that he's a person who is kind of fallen in on himself, and one of the reasons why his life is empty and why he's looking is because he doesn't have any real demands on his time or his gifts. So when you have kids, when you've got people who depend on you at work for things that that need to be done and everybody is going to, benefit from. Well, when you have those kinds of demands on you, in one way you could say, well, I'm bound. Yeah. But another way you can say, my life means something. There are a lot of other people.
You're stocked in the world of meaning.
Yeah.
You are in it. You don't have to create it. You're in it.
That's right. So I've got, 3 granddaughters and 2 more grandchildren on the way. I've got 3 grown children and their spouses. I've got my wife. I've got my church. I don't lack for meaning. Yeah. I can think of a zillion things to do at any moment of the day that are important, not just for me, but for other people.
Yeah, you're not participating, right? You're in reality, and it is there qualifying you in ways that are fundamentally meaning you and orienting you towards things. I mean, there's one set of questions that are asked at the much earlier. And it talks about this hunger, and I get it with this person. I mean, he's a human made in the image of God. They hunger. I mean, I'll never forget Schmann's famous work for the life of the world. What is the first thing you notice about the human being in the Garden of Eden? They hunger, right? And food is supplied, right? They hunger and thirst, and we are made incomplete. Where you talk about Calvin right at the beginning of the Institutes, where our own lack of self-sufficiency. Our hunger, if not, with bread and water, ultimately we end up hungering and thirsting again. But we keep doing it because we hunger for the bread of heaven, right, and the water of life, which Christ is. And so this is there. So their reductionisms can't eradicate it. Their fallenness can't eradicate it. The problem is one of the one who in the article she said is a person who started this way ended up embracing Catholicism, and her questions was, can we aim it the right way? Can we take the hunger and direct it towards the source that fulfills it? And it's interesting because one of the figures of this movement, this post-rationalism, it's named Chapman David Chapman or something along these lines. He shows that this group at this point, if they embrace this way of reading it, is not aiming it the right way. He is still governed by Kantian assumptions and relativism. And this is kind of the quote. Chapman writes on his website, talking about detached from real meaning, entails, he says that meaning is real but not definite, okay? It is neither objective or subjective. It is neither given by an external force nor a human invention. So, he's got time to play with dialectic. It requires, he says, taking from the eternalist stance the commitment that human beings do and should experience the world as a locus of meaning, but from the nihilist stance, the rejection that there's any single eternal source of meaning behind it. So what you give on the one hand, you take away on the other. And so if it is back down to my constructive capacities to give meaning, definition, and identity myself, I fall back in on myself. I'm not a participant in the reality that's out there. I'm not therefore participating in the orientation of my desires and hungers towards those things that will actually complete and fulfill them. And so Chapman has taken away the very thing in his openness that should have been given to Vogel.
Yeah, the thing about Chapman the things you read, the thing that strikes me is he's still living in his head. There are no people out there. In other words, he's talking about abstractions. He's talking about sort of summaries of reality that are perhaps more or less real. Subjective, objective. A single given. Well, what about people? Dude, have you ever made a sacrifice for a human being? Yeah. I'm not talking about an abstraction called the human race. Yeah. I'm not talking about all those people who are starving from hunger. I'm talking about a person personally who has a claim on you. Yeah. That's where meaning is discovered.
Yeah.
Yeah. 2 quotes that I thought were kind of interesting. One of them going back to what I said before about the psychotechnologies. Religion, meditation, magic, occultism, shadow work, all these in the meta-tribe model are mere avenues for self-development and self-transcendence. Cast a love spell, go to church, attend a 5 rhythms ecstatic dance class, take psychedelic mushrooms. All of these functionally amount to the same thing, an injection of what foundational post-rat writer David Chapman calls meaningness.
Meaningness.
Yes.
Now, I get why people avoid other people. We're fallen, and when people have a claim on you, they might use that claim to manipulate you and sort of damage you and try to get from you things that they don't have a right to have. I get that. So maybe some of this retreat into the abstract, this retreat into ideas, has to do with that.
But
fine.
There's another side to this, and what they're grasping for is the image of God. Only they don't know it. Listen to this next quote. If there's a doctrine underpinning both rationalist and post-rationalist thought, it is this quintessential liberal faith in human potential, combined with an awareness of the way in which human imaginal power does not merely respond to, but actively shapes the world around us. The rationalists dreamed of overcoming bias and annihilating death. The post-rats are more likely to dream of integrating our shadow selves or experiencing oneness. But both camps evince a profound faith in what we might call human godliness, the idea that we are not only the recipients of the world around us, but also its creators. Indeed, it's little wonder that so many meta-tribe members find themselves drawn to esoteric or occult spiritual schools of thought like chaos magic or traditionalism, schools in which it is difficult to distinguish the human power to shape and persuade from the outright supernatural. So what they're looking at here is humans, if I can put it in theological terms, humans as creations and as creators. That we are simultaneously part of the creation, but as images of God, we also shape the creation. We create, in a very real sense, the world around us. So they're grasping at something that's real, but they just don't get its real source.
They have it backwards. And this is one of the things is, so you notice in this what happens. They'll admit we're part of the real world, but we are kind of the apogee of it, which is true. We are the final created creature, right? There isn't something created after us and the rest. We are the image bearers. We are, as Corinthians, Colossians will say, the glory of God. Conform to Christ. We are the glory of God in the world. Think about that. Reference that. Here, check this out. So what happens? They want to embrace the idealist side of the imagination, the romantic idealist side, what you call magical realism, novelists, or Coleridge. And they're right about that, as we reiterate, as humans made in the image of God, what it is of God as a creator, as we take the creation we've been given dominance over and try to orient it towards and create and develop it in ways that are consistent with what it is as a reality. But it's fallen, of course, and the creation has thorns grown in it. But what we don't do is add to Coleridge Tolkien. Tolkien recognized as co-creators, we're co-creating with an objective reality that is out there that pushes up against us, that we aren't the creators of, and therefore it really isn't the conditions for us to be gods who order everything on the world, but it's actually the very condition and limit that we participate in that gives meaning and direction to our creative activities, so that we're doing them in light of what it means to be a creature rather than trying to build the Tower of Babel. That is fundamental, balancing Coleridge with Tolkien. That is kind of the way imagination in a Christian sense honors the fact that we're creatures, that we're not God, but we are image bearers of God and co-creators.
Yeah, this gets me thinking about something that's on everybody's mind and has been for a few years, and it's the whole transgender thing, and we've talked about it ad nauseum. But what we have is an unwillingness to receive, and at the same time understanding that we still have responsibility to do something with what we've received. So like when you think about the garden, obviously God makes the world, he speaks it into being, and then he tells Adam, okay, it's your turn to talk. Name the creatures. So there is something to that. And this is where the reason why postmodern and sort of critical theories have some salience is that they do have that part right. There is something that we do, but it's within the framework, and this is where Tolkien comes in as subcreators. So yes, you are a woman. That's not up for grabs. You don't create yourself out of nothing. Nevertheless, what are you going to do with it? That's worth considering. What kind of woman will you be? How will you pursue the development of your femininity, of your capacity to be a mother? What will you do with that stuff? That's where the freedom comes in. In one of my books, I described it this way. It's like, okay, when you think about a baseball game, you've got different players and they have positions. The position that the player plays is not oppressive. Willie Mays did not say, I can no longer be a center fielder because it doesn't allow me to express myself. What he did instead was he said, I'm a center fielder and I'm going to play center field in the way that only Willie Mays can play it. Yeah. And then everybody admires it. Look at what Willie Mays did. Look at what Willie Mays is capable of. He played center field like no one else. He didn't create center field out of nothing. He received it. He's going with the grain. He's working with his endowments with the grain of reality. It's like, here's a quote. I don't have the author here, but it says, this reality with which we collide releases a word, an invitation, a meaning as if upon impact. So our engagement with the world is already meaningful because the world is giving us a word from its own reality. It's not something not known in itself, a Kantian hidden, but it manifests itself. The world is like a word, a logos, which sends you further, calls you on to another beyond itself, further up. And this is where the language analogy, further up goes. Right. And so our capacity to work with that word that is given to us and cultivate it in accord with its nature and the potentials within it that are within our bounds is part of our capacity as those endowed as co-creators to be able to develop the creation in and be imaginative with it, with potentialities that are there for us to manifest the riches and glories that are ingredient in it. I mean, think of music when it is able to actually hear heaven, if you will. Think of that. And so what we have going on there is not us arbitrarily imposing our will on the world, but working with the grain of reality to open up it to dimensions of its connectedness to God that let the voice of the word manifest itself within it. That's a good place to stop. We're at the end of the show. Hey, we really appreciate your interest in the Theology Pugcast. We really appreciate, too, that you are so interested. You made it to the end of this episode. Now, there are a couple things we want you to know. You, as a reward, get to know about where we're going to be in June. On June 14th, on Wednesday in Memphis, we are going to be there at the PCA General Assembly to conduct a couple of live podcasts, and you are invited. We're going to be at the Courtyard Marriott, downtown Memphis, which is right next to the location of the PCA General Assembly. So you don't have to go very far. If you're in the PCA and you're intending to go to the assembly, it's just a short walk to where we'll be. And on the 14th, which is a Wednesday, we'll begin at about 3 p.m. and we'll go to 7 p.m., which means the most dull part of the day, when everybody is wondering what's for dinner, you can leave the assembly and go to someplace really cool where cool people are talking about cool things and not just simply Book of Church Order sort of protocol. And you can spend some time with Glenn and Tom and me and our guests. We've got a couple of guests who are joining us. George Grant is going to be one of our guests. And then Doug Groothuis. That's how Groothuis is going to be with us. And Doug is going to be talking about his latest book. And so we're excited to discuss that with him. So there's going to be a link in the show notes to some more information about being with us. You don't need to buy a ticket or anything like that. You can just come to the event. There'll be refreshments. There'll be time to fellowship, time to talk with us. And time to watch us kind of in action as we record a couple of shows. So we've got a 4-hour block. Another thing about that 4-hour block is we end before the big PCA 50th anniversary celebration that starts right next door. So it's not a situation in which you have to choose. Do I go to the big gala for the PCA, or do I hang out with the podcast guys? You can do both. So we'd love to see you. We'll have room for about 50 to 100 people. And that's for you to sort of take note of. Also, another thing is we've got our own Patreon page. And we've had a number of people come on to the page here recently and make a monthly pledge to the show. And we're very grateful for that. If you'd like to check it out, you can go to the link in the show notes that takes you to our Patreon page. And we encourage you to consider a monthly gift to help underwrite the show. Anyway, that's enough for me. We should probably take a moment to just say goodbye at this point. So let's do that. Bye-bye. Bye.
The Theology Pugcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy another of our podcasts, The Good Life Podcast, featuring Matt Carpenter interviewing experts in their field about how their work contributes to the good life.